Well, thank you for asking me to be here today. I will thank the North Plains congregation for letting Ralph and I do what we wanted to do, and we hope that it turns out as well as we envision it. Now, ignore part 2. That's Ralph's. It's our title. I don't embrace technology very well, so I have no PowerPoint. But please listen carefully. One way churches grow is by Christians, children becoming Christians. I mean, that's just the way it is. We hope that when we preach the gospel, we do affect others in everything we do. However, if we cannot convince our children, then how are we going to convince anyone else? So there is, I think, some connection between this and the preceding topics. You know, God considered Noah a successful preacher of righteousness. Peter said that Noah was a preacher of righteousness and saved seven others in 2 Peter 2 and 5. 1 Peter 3:20 says, in only a few people, talking about those who went in the ark, and all 8 were saved by water. In Genesis chapter 7, verse 23, only Noah was left and those that were with him in the ark. If we read only those passages, we wouldn't know who was with Noah in the ark. However, Hebrews chapter 7 and Hebrews 11 and 7 and Genesis 7 and 7 both tell us that he prepared an ark for the saving of his household, and Noah, his sons, and his wife and his sons' wives entered with him into the ark. You know, it's an interesting thing to me. Where did Noah get his wife? What happened to her family? Why didn't her family go with him into the ark? Not only did Noah convince his sons that there was going to be a flood, but he convinced his sons to convince some mate to get with them into the ark. Noah was a powerful preacher of righteousness. Somebody somewhere in that converted someone else. You know, not only God expects us to save our family. Not only was Noah powerful, God expects it. It is the way of righteous men. In Jacob chapter 70, in Psalms chapter 78 and 5, he decreed a statute for Jacob and established the law in Israel, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children. Joshua said, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. In Acts chapter 10, interesting to me, Acts 10, here's Cornelius. And Cornelius is a righteous man, the Bible says. And you know, when he brings Peter in to preach to him, all his household was there. We go to the 16th chapter of the book of Acts, and we find Lydia and her household. And her household was baptized with her. A little bit later in Acts 16, the jailer. Evidently, he had some great influence over his family, because as he goes home and they declare the way of the Lord more perfectly to him, he and his household were baptized that same hour of the night. Speaking of Abraham, God said in Genesis 18, for I have chosen him, so that he may direct his children and his household after him to keep the way of the Lord by doing what is right and just. So the Lord will bring about for Abraham what he has promised. To the elders, one of the qualifications is managing his own household well. If he doesn't know how to manage his household, how will he know how to manage the church of God? Even though many think it is not possible, I'm convinced that we can be successful. And that's really what this lesson is about. Proverbs 22 verse 6 says, train up a child in the way he should go, and when he is old, he will not depart from it. God expects us to train up a child. God expects us to train up a child in the way he should go, but how is it done? How do we do that? Well, let me start by saying how it is not accomplished. It is not accomplished by reading the latest study on rearing children. Many people believe that the Bible is outdated, that the modern researchers surely have a lot more knowledge and much more to know about than what God did. Let's not worry about the Bible. That's just old stuff. Well, you can find expert advice just about everywhere you turn. In fact, I looked up on the internet, which I don't do these kind of searches too often, but I looked up the top 10 parenting magazines. Did you know the top 10 parenting magazines sell 230 magazines every month? People are interested in how to rear their children. But let me tell you what. You can read those magazines, and there may be something valuable in them. But I'm telling you one thing they're not going to do. They are never going to tell you how to save your children. Never. Our society is being overrun, I guess you could call it that, by the Eastern religions. And just lately I noticed two Hindu churches had signed. One said, Raja Yoga, the quickest way to your highest potential. Is that what you want for your kids? Their highest potential? Another one said, equipping your children for life. Listen, I'm not talking about today equipping your children for life. I don't care if they're ditch diggers. I'm talking about equipping your children for eternity. And until we get priorities straight, we're going to fail. When we put more emphasis on the physical and on how much they make and all those kind of stuff, they're going to know what we think is important. I'm getting ahead of myself, aren't I? Sometimes people say, well, train up a child in the way he should go. I'm going to let him decide. No, let's just let this child decide which way he's going to go. Well, the quickest way to destroy your children is not do anything. Nehemiah chapter 13. Oh, sorry. I'm getting ahead of my notes here. So since I brought it up, no, I'll wait. I'm doing a Glenn with my notes here. Okay, so which way should your children ought to go? The first and most important thing you can do is before you ever have children, and that's choose a mate that's going to teach them the same thing that you want to teach them. Which way should they go? If father and mother disagree as to which way they should go and what's important, what are the children going to be taught? In Nehemiah chapter 13, verse 23, in those days I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. As for their children, half spoke the language of Ashdod, and none of them were able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck them, some of them, and pulled out their hair and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of your daughters for your sons for yourselves. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? What are your children going to be taught when we marry those who don't have the same principles? Let me remind you of Noah. In fact, I believe that that's the very teaching of Genesis chapter 6. The sons of God saw the daughters of men, and they were fair. The sons of God were the sons of Seth. The sons of the daughters of men were the daughters of Cain. And they married those who had no concern about righteousness at all. And it was the destruction of the world before the flood. In a little humorous way, as I began to think about picking the wrong mate and someone that didn't have the same principles, I was thinking of Noah and marrying a wife that wasn't interested. She might say, I'm not going to get in that old thing with all those filthy animals. Or, how do you know it's going to rain? Nobody else believes it's going to rain. If the flood really does happen, that thing probably won't float anyway. Well, all the parenting magazines in the world never talked about a boat and getting in it to save our children. You know, you get somebody that doesn't care about those things, and they're going to have all these negative. And the children, where are they going to be? They're going to be like Ashdod children. They're going to know something, but they're going to not really speak the language. Well, the Bible says, train up a child, or bring up a child. Ephesians chapter 6 verse 4 says, fathers, do not exasperate your children. Instead, bring them up in the training and instruction of the Lord. Bring them up is an interesting little term or little word. It really just means to bring to maturity. It is a two-part word. It's the word ek, which is out of. In this case, it's the word up. And the word to stiffen or fatten. And it is most of the time translated to feed and sometimes nourish. And that's why the King James, I think, used the word nurture. In the nurture and admonition of the Lord. It is used in this same sense, just without the word ek. In Luke chapter 4, verse 16, and he came to Nazareth where he had been brought up, speaking of Jesus. His word Jesus was raised from his earliest youth until he became a mature individual. Of the Lord, I think, is another very important thing that we need to look at. In the nurture and admonition, and the word admonition is the idea of warning or reminding or telling again. But it's of the Lord. When we say, well, we're members of the church of the Lord, what do we mean by that? Isn't we're the church that's God's or that pertains to the Lord? The same way here. The training we're talking about is the training that the Lord asks us to do. Things that pertain to the Lord. Children are to obey their parents. The Scripture clearly says in Ephesians chapter 6, verse 1, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Honor your father and your mother, which is the first commandment with promise, so that it may be well with you and that you may live long on the earth. Let me say right here, in case I forget, I loved what Elias said about children and respect, and young people and respect. You know, we have in our society now, we have third generations of people that were not parented, I would say. And they don't respect anything or anybody. They don't even respect themselves. Why? Well, because they were not taught to respect. Fathers, it says here, don't provoke your children to anger. I think that's a real interesting statement and an important statement because it is to fathers. It's specific, not just parents, even though surely we can take from that, mother shouldn't do it either. But I think it's more a fatherly thing. What does it mean? Don't anger your children. Well, my first thought on that is, why do I get angry? I'm just a mad fit waiting to happen. But not when things are going my way. Not when it's just exactly what I wanted. So, we get angry when we try, and we try, and we try. And we're just so determined, but then it seems like something just keeps chopping us off. We can never succeed. So as fathers, that seems to be a problem, because what we do sometime is, first of all, as heads of our families, we are to set the standard of what's going to be in our household. But sometimes we set standards that are really unattainable. We set the standard so high that the children become exasperated because they can never meet the standard. Or on the other hand, when they do something to measure up, little Johnny comes around and he thinks he's done something wonderful. Well, yeah, that's great, but... And it's never wonderful enough. We exasperate our children. We never allow them to succeed. And they become angry. And they lose respect for the parent, for the father. We as fathers, while we are tough, while we're strong, we're not really good fathers unless we're loving and kind as well. The Lord's loving kindness indeed it never ceases, for His compassions never fail. They're new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Our God is the great example of our Father. He's loving kindness from beginning to end. So we should not think that we should be harsh to our children. Colossians chapter 3, fathers, do not exasperate your children so they will not lose heart. That's the New American Standard. The NIV says, so they will not become discouraged. And the King James says, lest they be discouraged. So what he's talking about is this idea of discouraging them from the very thing that you're trying to get them to be. So we're not saying, okay, don't ever set boundaries and don't let them, don't expect them to meet those boundaries or meet those expectations. But we also need to be real about it as well. You know, the opposite of exasperating our children is this idea of nurture and admonition of the Lord. The word there, nurture, chastening, training, feeding, it's the idea of being a tutor. You train them. Now when you go to school, and it doesn't matter where you go to school, when you're schooled at whatever you're doing, you're taught something. So that there's an instruction element. And then after the instruction element, there is always either punishment or reward. In other words, if you do well, you get an A. If you don't do so well, you might get an F. At least that's what they did when I was in school. I brought home one or two of those, not very many. I remember the last one. I didn't really want my dad to see it. He said, you can do better than that. And that's all he said. That's all he needed to say. He was disappointed. Of course, I was in high school at the time. I wasn't in kindergarten anymore. Hebrews chapter 12, verse 5. You have forgotten the exhortation which is addressed to you as sons. My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor faint when you reprove him. There's that word training there, the discipline. For those whom the Lord loves, He disciplines, and scourges every son whom He receives. Endure hardness as discipline. God deals with you as with sons. For what son is there that his father does not discipline? For if you are without discipline, then you have become, of which you become partakers, then you're illegitimate children and not sons. If you don't have discipline, you don't have a father. Just that clear. You don't have anyone that loves you enough to care about the end result of your life. Furthermore, we have had earthly fathers disciplined us, and we respected them. Shall we not much rather be subject to the Father of spirits and live? For they disciplined us for a short time, as seemed best to them, but He disciplines us for our good pleasure, so that we may share in His holiness. Now, discipline is not, and He even says He scourges every son. So there is a physical element of this discipline here. But it's not just helter-skelter. It's not just, well, I'm going to give you a whipping once a week whether you need it or not. It has a purpose. Its purpose is to draw you back. Its purpose is a purpose of training. It's a purpose of knowing that you're off the rail. In fact, the very next verses there in Hebrews, he says, so then start walking on flat ground. I'm paraphrasing. Just walk on flat ground so your knees can be healed. You know, quit walking out there in the rough, because that's what brings all the problem. So you walk. What happens when we do good? You know, I was thinking, what illustration could I do? Simple illustration. You know, isn't it Hosea that talks about them making money and putting a bag with holes? Why? Because they had forgot the house of God. They were building their own houses, and they'd forgot God. But then what does 2 Corinthians 8 and 9 say? That He wants cheerful givers, and what He gives us sufficient so that we can give to others. When we do with it what He wants us to do with it, He rewards us. When we don't, let me tell you, if you're not doing with your money what you ought to do with it, and you're not receiving any punishment from the Lord, maybe you should wonder if God is your Father. Because if you don't have chastisement, then you don't have a Father. All discipline, verse 11 says, all discipline for the moment seems not to be joyous, but sorrowful. Yet to those who have been trained by it afterward, it yields a peaceable fruit of righteousness. And parenting, and if you don't get anything else out of what I say, just remember this. Parenting takes effort. It takes time. It takes energy. Perhaps that's why only the young people have children, because as we get old, the time and the energy to chase them. But you know, this idea that we teach them and then we correct them when they need correcting. Seen the situations, you know, where, there was a lot of correcting going on. But as soon as I gave him a whooping, it's done, and they never watch Johnny again. So Johnny doesn't learn anything by that, because he can go out and do the same thing over and over. He just knows, okay, as long as I can stand the whooping, I'm going to be fine. I'm going to do whatever I want to do. So it's about the training. Not just the fact that someone's paddles your hind end. It's about what's the end result of that. What are you doing that for? All training involves teaching, and teaching can be tedious. But all training is also for the improvement of the person, in this case children, and never for their destruction. As I said, the word admonition there is the word warning. It's the same word that used in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and 11. These things happened to them as examples and were written down as warnings for us, on whom the fulfillment of the ages has come. Titus 3:10, reject the factious person after the first and second warning. It's this idea of, will you tell them again? Again, training happens after repetition. Tell them again. Remind them. Warning. Now remember, you got a whooping for that last time. So we're not going to let you get by with this time. There's that. Again, there's consistency. What are we trying? We're training them. We're not just getting the kid from the cradle to the job. We want them to be something when they get to where they're going. Children need training. I'm going to go back and look at it from the child's perspective. Children need training. Train up a child in the way that he should go. Children are not mature enough to control their lives. When they're bouncing off the wall, and we've seen that plenty, when they're bouncing off the wall, you can know their parents have not been giving them much attention. At least the right kind of attention. They're begging for attention. When you show up at someone's house, and believe me, been there a lot of times, and the kids, and I love kids, but you know, they're just crawling from one end to the other, and you can't even have adult conversation because the children jump in every time, because someone somewhere is not giving them the attention they need. They need training. And they need to be taught this respect thing. And if we don't teach them, they're going to grow up without respect for anything, themselves included. Who wants to train up a child in the way he should not grow? If you want him to go the way he should not grow, then just leave him alone. And don't say anything to him, just let him go. Proverbs 29 verse 15 says, the rod and reproof give wisdom, but a child who gets his own way or left to himself will bring his mother shame. Proverbs 22 verse 15, foolishness is bound to the heart of a child. The rod of correction will drive it far from him. Proverbs 17 verse 21, to have a fool for a son brings grief, and there is no joy for a father of a fool. Proverbs 17:25, a foolish son brings grief to his father and bitterness to the one who bore him. Proverbs 13 verse 24, he who withholds his rod hates his son, but he who loves him disciplines him diligently. That's the New American Standard 25 or 95. NIV says, he who spares a rod hates his son, he who loves him is careful to discipline him. Why? Why? You know, that little Chinese girl that was going to fall into the hole a while ago, why don't you just let her fall in the hole? Because you love her. Same the reason here. He who hates his son just lets him go. Proverbs 19, discipline your son while there is hope. Do not desire his death. This is an interesting passage. The New American Standard, don't desire his death. The NIV says, do not be a willing party to his death. The King James says, let not your soul spare for his crying. So there's a little diverse way to define that, but in the end result is the same, is you don't want his destruction. You want to make sure that you ward that off. That's what it's all about. Proverbs 23, verse 13 and 14. Do not hold back discipline from the child. Although you strike him with the rod, he will not die. You will strike him with a rod and rescue his soul from Sheol, or the grave. Proverbs 29, 17. Discipline your son, and he will give you peace. He will bring delight to your soul. Our society is now reaping the result of children left to themselves with no respect. If discipline is such a bad thing, and we are taught, listen, we are taught over and over and over, you know, don't discipline, you're being harsh. If it's such a bad thing, why is it that those who have been trained by it don't think it's bad? Why is it that we're thrilled, we're blessed to have parents that loved us? Tell you what happens a lot of times, the children who are left to themselves, they're the ones that grow up and they hate their parents. They despise them. You know, perhaps, I've got a few perhapses here, but Adonijah tried to usurp the throne toward the end of David's life. 1 Kings chapter 1, verse 5 and 6. Now Adonijah, whose mother was Higgith, put himself forward and said, I will be king. So he got chariots and horses ready with 50 men to run ahead of him. His father had never interfered with him by asking, why have you behaved as you do? David had just left this guy alone. He was also very handsome and was born next to Absalom. You know, the most important thing, I think, though, about rearing our children is not just that we correct them, we teach them what's right, we correct them when they're wrong, and we give them reward when they're right. But the most important thing is to dedicate your house to the Lord. Interesting to me is train up a child in the way he should go in Proverbs 22 and 6. The word train up there is used 3 other times, that particular form of the word. In Deuteronomy chapter 20 verse 5 says, the officers also shall speak to the people saying, who is the man that has built a new house that has not dedicated it? Let him depart and return to his house, otherwise he might die in battle, and another man might dedicate his house. Then it is used in 1 Kings 8:63, 2 Chronicles 7 and 5. I'll read only one of those because they refer to the same thing. King Solomon offered a sacrifice of 22,000 oxen, 120,000 sheep, Thus the king and all the people dedicated the house. It is translated the word dedicate in these three other places. The Lord should be the center of our existence. It should be the center of our house. Deuteronomy 4, verse 9 beginning. Only be careful and watch yourselves closely so that you do not forget the things your eyes have seen, or let them slip from your heart as long as you live. Teach them to your children and your children after them. Remember the day you stood before the Lord your God at Horeb, when he said to me, assemble the people before me to hear my words, so that they may learn to revere me as long as they live in the land, and may teach them to their children. Deuteronomy 6 says, these commands I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. The word impress there means to make a point of. And it is said to be figuratively mean inculcate. In other words, it makes a part of them. You make these things a part of their life. Deuteronomy 11, verse 19. Teach them to your children. Talk about them when you sit at home, and when you walk along the road, and when you lie down, and when you get up. Write them on the doorpost of your house and on your gates, so that your days and the days of your children may be many in the land the Lord swore to give your forefathers, as many as the days that the heavens are of the earth. Psalm 78, verse 4. We will not hide them from their children. We will tell the next generation the praiseworthy deeds of the Lord, his power, and the wonders he has done. He decreed statutes for Jacob and established a law in Israel, which he commanded our forefathers to teach their children, so the next generation may know them, even the children yet to be born. And they in turn would tell their children. Why? So they would not be like their forefathers, stubborn and rebellious generations whose heart was not loyal to the Lord. Tell your children, and tell them again. One of the things we seemed quite prominent, especially on the Thursday night, was that idea of boldness. Are we bold to our children? Are we afraid to let them know what God thinks about things? Do we think, and I know this is just a pet of mine, but do we think the professors in the college knows a lot more about it than God does? If we do, so will your children. And they will disregard and disrespect the Lord. I might make it. The value of mother. We talked a little bit about fathers, but I want to talk about the value of mother. Bringing up a child, bringing up children, is part of the role of women before the Lord. In 1 Timothy chapter 2, verse 15, she will be saved through childbearing if they continue in faith, love, and holiness with propriety. Now, I don't have time. I'm not going to take the time right now to expound on that, except to say I believe that childbearing there means her role as mother. It means that in the context, men are to pray everywhere, lifting up holy hands without wrath and doubting. She can't. She's forbidden there. But her role is at home, and her role is teaching her children. 1 Timothy 5, verse 14, therefore I want younger widows to get married, bear children, keep the house, give the enemy no occasion for reproach. Why does he say that? He said, these young widows, if you're not cautious, they're going to be out there just going to be without a role, without a work, and they're going to be busybodies, and it's not going to be good. They should just go and find a husband, have children, and do the things that God has designed. Widow indeed, if she have brought up children. Chapter 5 at verse 10. She is the one who inculcates the principles to her children from the youth, from the cradle on. Have you ever wondered? I have, and I have an answer. Now, I don't know if I'm right, but I have wondered why in the Old Testament, in the log of the kings of Israel and Judah, why we always have to know who the mom was. Because it's the king, and it's his lineage that makes the son the king, but invariably it will say, and his mother was. And his mother was. And his mother was. Well, here's what I think. I think the reason we know who the mother was is because that tells something about the kind of king he's going to be. Because she has impressed upon him the principles, either good or bad. You know, I said something just last April was Don McCord held a meeting in Cottage Grove, and I went down and spent some time with him. Not just at the meeting, but one day we got to sit down and just visit. Somehow we got on this. And I told him, I said, here's what I think. I think the mothers have more to do with the way the children turn out than the fathers. And I just said that because of Don's response. In Don's great way, well, brother, I know that's so. It has to be so. I've just seen it too many times. Now that's not to say there's not exceptions to the rule. But mothers, do not ever underestimate your role. And I think Ralph's going to talk more about that after a little bit. In Proverbs 31 it says, the words of King Lemuel, the oracle which his mother taught him. Do you know, or do you think it's coincidental? Is it just happenstance that the two kids of David who tried to usurp the throne had the same mother? Absalom and Adonijah. Maybe it's the reason he didn't even try to train them. I don't know. Timothy learned from a child, from his childhood. And the word childhood there really means infant, even unborn. It's like from the earliest. He knew the Scripture because of his mother and because of his grandmother. Paul came also to Derbe at Lystra, a disciple that was there named Timothy, the son of a Jewish woman who was a believer, but his father was a Greek. So it was his mother that inculcated these principles in him. Well, when we've brought them up. So we bring them up from infants to adults. When we bring them up, they're still our children. Now they are out of our household, and we sustain a different relationship. But we never quit being their parents. We perhaps now don't take them and bend them over our knee. But we should never be timid in correcting and telling them what we think. My children probably think sometimes I should be timid in telling them what I think. But I'm still the parent. Now they're going to choose their way. They're already grown. And they sometimes have more wisdom than me. But I have a role. And I have to sustain that role. You know, Eli was rebuked because he didn't correct his older children. Now, Eli had even went and told them, the sons, I hear what you've been doing. I hear you. And you need to not do that. However, a little bit farther in the chapter, this is 1 Samuel 2, a little bit farther in the chapter, we learn that Eli had been some way benefited by how their sons had taken more meat than they should have. That's verse 29, if you want to go look that up. But then in chapter 3, at verse 13, for I have told him that I am about to judge his house forever for the iniquity which he knew, because his sons brought a curse on them, and he did not rebuke them. So even though he had went and said, you should stop, God said, you're honoring them more than you honor me, because you're not making them quit. He who loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. He that loves son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. So we have to still be the parent. Whatever we can be, whatever we can do. I am not content with giving up on any kid. Not a one. Not a child, not a grandchild. Hopefully for long, not a great-grandchild. Not a one. So let me quit by saying, Well, let me quit my part by saying there's no perfect parent. There's no perfect parent because there's no perfect person. So we don't have to do this perfectly. It does help, though, if you get a mate. Jared told me not just too long ago that he and Jasandra was so glad that they had both of us, because either one of us by ourselves would have been intolerable.